This is where freedom rings.
If you believe in America, if you believe in the Constitution empowers us. It's a new day. America's back. America's back, and America's going to get strong again. We're going to defend America, and we're going to defend our interests.
Liberty's voice, Levin TV.
Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin. This is Levin TV. And tonight, we're going to do something a little differently. I'm going to represent the President of the United States on the floor of the Senate in the opening of the so-called impeachment trial. Now that you've heard the President's lawyers and Mr. Schiff, I just felt maybe I ought to take a shot at this. Here goes. Thank you, Senators, Mr. Chief Justice, House managers, and the President's legal team. We are here today not to defend the Constitution against the President of the United States, but to defend the Constitution from the House managers. Two of the House managers were chairmen of two of the so-called impeachment committees in the House of Representatives. Mr. Schiff, you know well, was chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. Mr. Nadler was chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. And they come here before the United States Senate, 100 senators, 300 million Americans, the Chief Justice of the United States, and they say, we need witnesses to prove our case. And if we don't get witnesses, it's a cover-up. It's a sham. We need a fair, impartial process. The United States Constitution could not be clearer. The framers could not have been clearer. After debating at length the impeachment clause of the Constitution, they came up with very specific language on what the House can do if it seeks to impeach a president. The House is limited in what it can do to start the process of removing a president of the United States. Treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. As I stand here before you today, they have presented no information on treason, no information on bribery. Those words don't even exist in their so-called impeachment charges. And other high crimes and misdemeanors, meaning other offenses that are as serious as treason and bribery. Where is it? Just tell us. Where's the treason? Where's the bribery? What are the other high crimes and misdemeanors? So what did they do? They amended the Constitution of the United States illegally. They changed the language to fit their narrative. And now they come before the United States Senate and say, if you don't accept their narrative, if you don't accept their impeachment charges, then you, the United States Senate, you're involved in a cover-up. You're obstructing. You're not doing justice. It's kind of upside down, isn't it? No, we are here to defend the Constitution of the United States from the majority in the House of Representatives and these managers. There is no treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. That's why they come to you with obstruction of Congress. Obstruction of Congress. The last time I checked, this body is part of Congress. The managers represent the majority in the House. I say the majority in the House because they couldn't persuade a single Republican, despite the diversity of the Republican caucus, not one, to join them in their effort to remove a constitutionally duly elected president of the United States. Not one. So it is one party in the House of Representatives. And they come into this body and they insist that you do what they would not do. Prove the case for treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. They voted to impeach the President of the United States, to remove the President of the United States for treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. But oops, they changed the language to obstruction of Congress and abuse of power. Now, we know the history of the impeachment clause of the Constitution, no thanks to Adam Schiff or Jerry Nadler or the Democrats in the House. We know it because the history's written down, most conclusively by James Madison. He was actually at the Constitutional Convention and had the most active role in framing our Constitution, the #1 framer. George Mason, a great founding father, who wrote the Virginia Declaration of Rights a few weeks before Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence. He was at the Constitutional Convention throughout. He suggested that a president could be impeached by the House for maladministration. James Madison stood up and said, maladministration? That means the House of Representatives and the United States Senate could remove a president of the United States basically over policy differences. We can't have that because the president of the United States would then be answerable to, kidnapped by, if you will, the House of Representatives and the United States Senate. We have 3 independent co-equal bodies. The House of Representatives doesn't have illimitable power. The House of Representatives may be motivated by politics, but this is a constitutional process. And these managers, 2 of whom were chairmen, who controlled the whole process, come into this body. They don't have one argument they can make for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. They seek to amend the Constitution, and then they demand that you help them make their case. They just voted. What is their case? They have no case. They sat on it for weeks before they sent it to the United States Senate. They've come up with conflicting arguments. We have to remove the president quickly because of national security concerns. And he may corrupt the next election. Then they sit on it. Then they come in here and say, slow down. We want witnesses. We want evidence. This is about the Constitution of the United States, not what the majority party in the House of Representatives demands. They had iron fist control in the House of Representatives, and they used it. And now they come over here and seek to lecture you, the United States Senate, on what witnesses you can call. They don't want all witnesses here. They only want their witnesses here. They don't want Hunter Biden, even though they say the President of the United States sought Ukraine's interference in the 2020 election. Ladies and gentlemen, read the transcript of the President's phone call. He didn't seek Ukraine's interference in anything, any more than he sought Russia's interference in anything. He didn't seek anybody's interference in anything. He wanted to know if the Bidens participated in corrupt practices. Why should they be immune? Why should they be the bubble family, where only the Trump family is investigated, with endless subpoenas, with a special counsel, with all kinds of power thrown at the president? He can be investigated. In fact, this entire impeachment is intended to immunize the Bidens so you can never raise any questions about them, to affect the 2020 election, which is why it's timed the way it has been, and to continue to attack the credibility of the 2016 election. How do we know this? They have no evidence of treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors, so they changed the bar. They lowered it. Now let's talk about what these managers who were handpicked by Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, did when they were running the House of Representatives in these committees. They talk about transparency. Well, when they held testimony, sworn testimony of witnesses in the basement of the House of Representatives in the SCIF, leaked transcripts to the media, cherry-picked information. Some of the transcripts still haven't been released in full in order to determine the witnesses that would best fit their narrative. Was that transparent? When they denied the Republicans the right to call their witnesses, including the so-called whistleblower, including the chief House manager, was that transparency? When the President of the United States, the target of their wrath and their impeachment, was unable to have his counsel present during any of this process in the House Intelligence Committee, to present witnesses, to cross-examine witnesses, to present evidence in that phase, in that impeachment, was that transparency? When the House Judiciary Committee took what the House Intelligence Committee did and regurgitated and had 2 hearings, one with 4 law professors and one with the lawyers representing both sides of the House Intelligence Committee, Was that really a serious impeachment inquiry, ladies and gentlemen? They couldn't get one Republican to go along. So the President of the United States was denied the due process that was afforded Richard Nixon. He was denied the due process that was afforded Bill Clinton. He was even denied the due process that was afforded Andrew Johnson, who was so shabbily treated during the impeachment back in the 1860s. And everybody agrees that that was an outrageous impeachment. Now, what is the role of the Senate? You've heard from the House managers who can't even get the role of the House right, who can't even get the Constitution's language right. You've heard them tell you, your role is to have a real trial with witnesses and evidence, but only the witnesses they want and only the evidence they want. And they want you, this Senate, to lower itself, to get information thrown over the transom at the 11th hour by Ukrainian national Les Parnas, who's been indicted on multiple felony counts in the Southern District of New York. They insist that you listen to him. They want you to take the testimony of the president's former National Security Counsel, his chief of staff, among others. And I want to break this down very carefully so it can be understood by all. Number one, the framers of the Constitution carved out a special role for the United States Senate. The framers of the Constitution weren't even sure if there should be impeachment. There was great debate over this. Some argued, look, the president's elected every 4 years. We don't really think this is a particularly good idea to give this kind of power to Congress, particularly the House. Others argued, look, if something truly awful takes place between elections, somebody has to have a check on the office of the presidency. And so they came up with a process. Very specific language: treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. They used English common law, the English experience. They rejected some of it, adopted some of it, and created some of their own ideas on how the institution should function. That's the box that the House is in. Treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. I've mentioned it half a dozen times so we can remember what the House's job is. The House didn't do its job. It changed its job. So what's the Senate's job? Well, the House can vote to impeach by a single one-vote majority. And of course, factionalism and the winds of change in politics affect the House more than any other body because those members are elected every 2 years. Well, the framers understood that. They created the House. There was no House till they created the House. But then they created the Senate, whose members used to be appointed by the legislatures. Now, with the 17th Amendment, they're elected. Fine. But the Senate has a different role. The Senate is not a lapdog to the House of Representatives. The Senate is not a lapdog to the majority party in the House of Representatives that railroaded this president, that had a Star Chamber proceeding, that rejected the language in the Constitution, that rushed to judgment and then withheld judgment because of political winds. It's the Senate's job to be the check on the House. There's no other check on the House. And that's the way the framers wanted it. So here you sit, and I stand in front of the Chief Justice of the United States. While his role is ministerial, it's majestic. He's the Chief Justice of the United States. They didn't give this responsibility to a court because they didn't think it was purely a legal matter. They wrote down in the Constitution the basic outlines of what's supposed to occur because it's not purely a political matter, even though there's political motivations. It is a constitutional process. Now, having violated that constitutional process in the House of Representatives, both in terms of tradition and the actual language in the Constitution, violated their own rules, violated the due process that's been afforded presidents and judges in the past facing potential impeachment. Now they come here. What's your job under the Constitution? Well, you'll decide, but I want to give some friendly advice. The reason why the Senate decides, the Chief Justice sits behind me, and the Constitution specifically says that a president can only be convicted not with a simple majority, but a supermajority of 2/3 of the vote, 2/3 of your votes, is so you can, in fact, defend the Constitution when the Constitution must be defended. The House managers want you to believe it's the President of the United States who violated the Constitution. It is our contention, it is the majority in the House that has violated the Constitution, because they can't even state with specificity what exactly it is under the Constitution that the president violated. So they want to turn the Senate into a circus, much the way they had the House conduct itself as a circus. But Nancy Pelosi doesn't control the Senate. These two chairmen and the House managers, they don't control the Senate. You do. Now, again, the framers of the Constitution, do you think they'd want you to be calling witnesses and provide testimony and additional evidence, when in fact, the beginning of this process, the impeachment of this process, was so corrupt and unconstitutional? Let me suggest to you, no. They have now lowered the bar for impeachment. They have now effectively amended the Constitution without going through Congress, 2/3 votes of both houses and 3/4 votes of the state legislatures. They have effectively amended the Constitution. So policy disagreements can now be a constitutional basis for removing a president of the United States. Let's take a look at this. Obstruction of Congress. Did the president obstruct the Senate? No. Did the president obstruct Congress? No, not in its legitimate functions. What are they talking about then? They premeditatedly issued a slew of subpoenas that they knew the President of the United States and the United States Department of Justice would have to fight in a federal court in order to protect separation of powers and the independence of the office of the presidency. Not so much President Trump, but the institution. The Constitution doesn't give the House of Representatives or the majority party in the House of Representatives illimitable power. They have to stay in their box, too. The President has a box, the Senate has a box, the courts have a box. The states have a box, the federal government and all have a box. So when the House makes demands for witnesses or information that historically it has not had the right to receive, to have access to, and we have court decisions in this respect, and the President of the United States says, all right, look, we're going to go to court, we're going to litigate this, we're going to go to a neutral decider, an adjudicator, the court, with judicial review. This House, under that party, has said that's obstruction of Congress. No, that's not obstruction of Congress. That's exactly what a president is supposed to do. The problem is, it is the House of Representatives, under the majority party, that is violating all the norms, that has said, you know what? We're going to be all roles. We're going to play all roles here. We're going to prosecute, and we're going to adjudicate. No president in American history, I heard Mr. Schiff here say, no president has ever conducted himself the way Donald Trump has. Well, Mr. Schiff's knowledge of American history is rather short, and I'll get to that in a moment. No president has ever been treated so shabbily, so unconstitutionally by a House of Representatives as has Donald Trump. Not one. Not one. What would happen if they're right on this charge, obstruction of Congress? It would mean that Congress would control the presidency, that the presidency would have no independence, that they can call the president's chief of staff, his attorney, his national security advisor. In other words, the closest people that the president must turn to for counsel. What they're telling you, the House managers, what the minority party in this chamber is telling you is, too bad. Too bad. If we make a claim, if we have enough votes for a subpoena, they have to turn over these witnesses and turn over the documents. But that's not what the court has said. That's not what the Supreme Court has said, is it, Mr. Chief Justice? That's not what George Washington said. That's not what Thomas Jefferson said from the beginning. It's been understood that to have co-equal branches, separation of powers, independence, one branch can't have so much power over another branch. And I dare say that these House managers sitting here today, and many senators before the cameras today, who are saying, we want our witnesses, we want our documents, if they were asked to turn over their chief of staff or their general counsels or the text messages, emails, and other documentation that has circulated in their office and the advice that they have received from their closest staffers, they might be offended by that. In fact, I know they'd be offended by that. That's one reason the Freedom of Information Act doesn't apply to Congress because they've excluded themselves. With all due respect, you've excluded yourselves. Now this phrase, the next one, abuse of power. Abuse of power. There's not a president who has served in the Oval Office who couldn't be impeached for abuse of power. Because the party opposite, when they control one or both houses of Congress, always accuses the president of abusing power. And in some cases, they really do. I've heard it said by the House managers, members in their party, both in the House and the Senate, and others in the media, that this president has abused power like no other president, that he's invited a foreign government to interfere in our election. That's not what that phone call says. He doesn't invite a foreign government to interfere in the election. And keep something in mind. President Trump had no idea that that phone call would be made public. He released it on his own. It was so innocent, and I would argue exculpatory, that he released it. He wanted it out. It's been twisted and turned and redefined, and the chief manager for the House, when he was holding his hearing at first in the House Intelligence Committee, had to change what the president said, had to create a fictionalized narrative of what the president said in order to try to persuade the American people that, in fact, what the president did was wrong, but the president didn't do anything wrong. Then they poll-tested phrases like bribery and extortion. Well, they weren't flying, but there was no bribery and extortion. The key witnesses, notice they don't want the president of Ukraine here. The key witnesses say there was no pressure, there was no bribe, there was no quid pro quo, even in their impeachment documents. While they dance around it, the charges, no bribery, nothing of the sort. Now let's talk about this for a moment. Abuse of power. This is the new line they want to use as they seek to amend the Constitution without going through the amendment process. Never before have we seen a president do anything like this. Really? Well, they were alive, and some of them were serving in the 1990s when Bill Clinton was running for re-election. And the Red Chinese military poured millions of dollars into the Clinton campaign, the Clinton Defense Fund, the DNC, and to several Democrat candidates running for office. Charlie Tree, remember him? John Wang, the Riyadi Group. It's all there. It's on the public record for all to see. There wasn't even an independent counsel or special counsel investigation. The whole matter was dropped after Bill Clinton was reelected. Now that was real money poured into a campaign to help a candidate, a Democrat, Bill Clinton. And although Bill Clinton in this very body was impeached because he was accused of violating 11 federal statutes, 11 felonies. 11 felonies. You'll see none in these claims against the President of the United States currently. Clinton, perjury, witness tampering, obstruction, and so forth. Trump, none of that. But no concerns when the Red Chinese military were pouring money into the Democrat Party, into the Clinton campaign and the Clinton's Defense Fund. Nothing. Nothing. When the Lion of the Senate, no disrespect, but these are the facts. The late Senator Ted Kennedy from Massachusetts. After the Soviet Union fell and the documents became available and the files were open to the KGB, we learned what? Ted Kennedy, through a surrogate, had made contact with the head of the KGB to try to defeat Ronald Reagan as he was running for re-election. But they say they're concerned about interference. Senator Kennedy back then, when it became public, he was alive. There wasn't a single congressional hearing. There wasn't a single ethics investigation. And the media all but ignored the whole thing. Well, isn't that interfering with an election? There's an innocent phone call with President Trump, and these folks want you to believe it's the crime of the century. Well, if it's the crime of the century, why are they making up phrases? The term treason, the term bribery, high crimes and misdemeanors, that's what they have to show. They voted on that, but they actually didn't. They voted on abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. The President of the United States didn't abuse his power. He was concerned about corruption in Ukraine. You know who else was concerned about corruption in Ukraine? Barack Obama. Barack Obama refused to release funds for offensive military equipment to the Ukrainian government while the Russians were invading Ukraine and annexing Crimea. President Trump comes into office, first year, releases funds to the Ukrainian government. Second year, releases funds to the Ukrainian government. Offensive military weaponry funds that the Barack Obama Democrat administration refused. The third year, he says, all right, we have a new president there. He's supposed to be reformer. I got to check this out. So he waits 55 days, and he gives them their money, over $400 million. Over $400 million. He waited 55 days. The Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, waited a full month until she sent the articles of impeachment to the Senate. I admit a month isn't 55 days, but it was a delay on a constitutional matter and a crisis that they created. This is nonsense. They don't have a single witness. They didn't have one in the House when they voted to remove this president. That's what impeachment is about. They're telling you, you need to remove this president. Not a single witness before the House Intelligence Committee. Not one. One asked, said the president had committed bribery or that there was a quid pro quo or connected to. And in the House Judiciary Committee, they didn't call any witnesses to make that. But now they say, oh, we've got witnesses now. But we need to hear from John Bolton. We need to hear from this. We need to hear from that. That's a fool's errand, ladies and gentlemen, in the United States Senate. And you must reject that. But let's look at what other presidents have done. Abuse of power. Tell me, would these House managers and their party in the House and would this Senate have removed John Adams? The original Sedition Act, the Alien Sedition Act, John Adams put journalists in prison and shut down several newspapers that challenged his government and his policies. That's one of the reasons why Jefferson won in the next election. And then eliminated the Alien and Sedition Acts. But would this body have considered that abuse of power? And would you have removed from the presidency the second president of the United States, one of the founding fathers? Think about it. Abraham Lincoln is considered one of our greatest presidents ever. Now, of course, we had a civil war, and that's the context of the points I'm about to make, but he suspended habeas corpus. Read the Constitution. Only you can suspend habeas corpus, but he did it anyway. The Supreme Court eventually reversed him, but after the Civil War was pretty much over. Abraham Lincoln, through his Secretary of War, shut down 300 newspapers, including some newspapers in the North. Was that abuse of power? Abraham Lincoln even had his Secretary of War imprison certain journalists and other people, politicians among others, who were hostile to his positions on the Civil War, including a member of Congress from Ohio, who they deported from Ohio and sent into the Confederate territories. Should Abraham Lincoln have been impeached and removed from office? Wow. Let's go on. Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson had the 1917 Espionage Act passed, and it was amended to include sedition, as it was under the John Adams administration. He put individuals in prison who were his political opponents, hardcore socialists among them. He also unleashed a propaganda effort with the media and was also responsible for shutting down certain newspaper outlets. Should Woodrow Wilson have been impeached? How about when Woodrow Wilson resegregated what would be known as the civil service? Should he have been impeached for that? Let's move on. Just some examples. Franklin Roosevelt signed a military order, my memory is 9066, ordering his generals to round up Japanese Americans and Americans of Japanese descent, and by the way, some Italian Americans and German Americans too, but mostly Japanese, took their private property away, their homes and their businesses, moved them into the interior of the United States, where the military built literally internment camps to keep about 120,000 of them. Should FDR have been impeached? The Supreme Court upheld it. The case is called Korematsu, right, Mr. Chief Justice? How about Franklin Roosevelt unleashing the IRS against political opponents and media outlets? Like Annenberg, a newspaper magnate in Philadelphia, on the Philadelphia Inquirer, that was very hostile to FDR and his administration. He tried to shut it down. He also tried to help the competitor newspaper that supported him. How about Gannett? Gannett was also targeted by the IRS. How about Andrew Mellon, the Treasury Secretary under Coolidge? He directed his Secretary of Treasury, Morgenthau, to get Mellon and put him in prison. For 10 years, the IRS chased Mellon. He was an innocent man. He paid his taxes. They brought him in the federal court. He won. But they attacked him, and he wound up in the end paying a penalty. But he tried to take him out. FDR sicked the IRS on Huey Long. And we know about Huey Long in Louisiana, and they were close to nabbing him. But then he was assassinated in the capital, Louisiana. How about this one? FDR intervened with the IRS to protect a congressman who was one of the most outspoken defenders of him and the New Deal. That congressman, who was being investigated by the IRS, and they were about to pull the trigger, his name was Lyndon Johnson. And he called off the IRS. How about a few more examples that Mr. Schiff and the other House managers, and perhaps others here, are unfamiliar with, just to put things in proper context, since this is, in fact, an impeachment trial. What about John Kennedy? John Kennedy had an individual staked out at the IRS who would go through files for him. And among the files they went through were conservative organizations with which he disagreed. He knew the tax returns of J. Paul Getty, and he would discuss them with individuals at Newsweek, Ben Bradley, and other individuals at the Washington Post. And there were other activities in that administration, which I shall not get into, but raised serious concerns. How about Lyndon Johnson? He used the IRS, the FBI, and the CIA against his political opponents. He used it to spy on civil rights groups. He used it to tap the phones of Martin Luther King. He even tapped the phone of Hubert Humphrey to find out when he was running for the Democrat nomination for president if he supported Johnson's position on the Vietnam War. He used the CIA to spy on the Goldwater campaign. It got so bad that the Goldwater campaign had to have meetings outside of their headquarters because they knew they were being surveilled. Should he have been impeached? Let me pick one more. Barack Obama. The Obama administration sicked the FBI on an investigative reporter for the New York Times, James Risen. They sicked the FBI on a reporter for Fox News, James Rosen. They sicked the FBI on the Associated Press, which resulted in more than a dozen reporters being surveilled in one form or another. Is that a problem? Is that abuse of power? The IRS going after Tea Party organizations, was that an abuse of power? The selling of arms to drug lords south of the border resulting in the death of a law enforcement officer, was that abuse of power? I'm laying out this history because abuse of power can mean many things to many people. The President of the United States made a phone call. He didn't use the IRS. He didn't use the FBI. He didn't put reporters in prison. He didn't shut down newspapers. All he did is say to the President of Ukraine, do us a favor. Take a look at Ukraine's involvement in the 2016 campaign. I mean, after all, Politico wrote about it. A Foreign Policy magazine wrote about it. The New York Times mentioned it. It's been out there. We'd like to know what happened, and please work with the Attorney General because there's an ongoing criminal investigation looking into all these matters. And then later on, almost in passing, he brings up Hunter Biden and Joe Biden and information he'd been reading. It's out there publicly. He didn't make it up. About Burisma, and asked them if they would look into that too. He didn't say, interfere in the election, get the Bidens, leak it, do this, none of it. It's interesting, in the Mueller investigation, 500 pages of nothing, which the opposition party in the House tried to use at first to impeach the president, brought Mr. Mueller in, that didn't work, accused the president of obstruction, that didn't work, because after all, hundreds and hundreds of witnesses, hundreds and hundreds of subpoenas, a million pages of documents. Not once did the president assert any privilege, attorney-client privilege, executive privilege. And yet when Bill Clinton was under investigation, he asserted every privilege and made up privileges. This president has been completely transparent with law enforcement and prosecutors. But in the Mueller report itself, Mueller says that they worked with 13 governments to track down this Russia collusion hoax. They found nothing. No collusion. They found nothing. Our investigators work with foreign governments all the time. The Attorney General is doing it today. The U.S. Attorney from Connecticut, who's been tasked with investigating aspects of that investigation. He's working with foreign governments today. It happens all the time. But the House managers and the majority in the House would have you believe that what the president did was so unusual, so exceptional, such an abuse of power. And now that I provided this context, I'm demonstrating that it wasn't abuse of power at all. Not at all. Now, I understand this is a difficult process for some people. There are difficult elections taking place. But this is the place that the founders decided, the framers of the Constitution, where justice, fairness, impartiality would be done. Justice, fairness, impartiality for the target, the President of the United States, not for the House managers, who conducted themselves in ways that I'm sure their framers would be very, very concerned about. In fact, I think they would detest what they did. So they throw around, in a real trial, we would have witnesses. In a real trial, we would have evidence. In a real trial, that case would have been dismissed, and any of those involved who were lawyers would be disbarred for failure to accept even a modicum of due process. This isn't a criminal trial. It's not a civil trial. This is a constitutional matter that is unique to our government, and the role that the Senate plays is uniquely different than a criminal trial or a civil trial. What needs to be done here, in my humble opinion, is this body should defend the Constitution against what took place by the majority in the House of Representatives, breathe life back into the impeachment clause so it can't be used like this again, put the House on trial for what it did, rather than the victim of what the House did, the President of the United States. And we look forward to this trial taking place in the days ahead. Thank you.